All right, once you've figured out what kind of camera you want to buy, now it's time to decide what lens to buy. And when it comes to buying a lens, there are three main things that I look for. Number one is, what does it see? Number two, how well does it see it? And number three, how much light do you need to see it? Now there's also 7 smaller things that I look for, and I'll mention those at the end, but let's first talk about these main 3. The first one is, what does it see? This refers to the focal length or field of view. Do you want a wide field of view, a standard field of view, or a telephoto field of view? And depending on what you want to shoot will depend on which focal length will work best for you. Now I have a whole video talking about focal length and deciding which lens to use when, but generally speaking, a wide-angle lens is a great option for landscape, architecture, real estate, and in-action type shots, as it gives you a wider perspective that allows you to see more of your surroundings. My Laowa 12mm is my widest angle lens that I use for real estate videos with my 1DX Mark II, because my 1DX has a 1.35 crop factor when shooting in 4K, so 12 times 1.35 is about 16mm, which is the focal length I like to be at for real estate, as it gives me a similar field of view to my 16 to 35mm lens on a full frame camera, which is what I've gotten used to using over the years. And the third wide angle lens that I use often is the Sigma 20mm. That is the lens that you're seeing this on right now that I'm using on my 1DX Mark II and that I use for a lot of my tutorials. And as I mentioned in the buying a camera video, if you don't buy a full frame sensor camera, you need to be aware that your crop sensor camera is going to change your field of view. So for example, if you buy an APS-C sensor camera like the Canon 80D, I'd recommend getting a Sigma 10-20 or a Tokina 11-20, as those focal lengths will equal out to be about 16 to 35 when you times it by the 1.6 crop factor. And if you're on a micro four thirds camera like a Panasonic GH5, you'll need to look into a lens like a 7-14, as micro four thirds sensors have a 2 times crop, so that would put your 7-14 at about a 14-28. Keep in mind also that some cameras like my 1DX Mark II, even though it is a full frame camera, when you shoot in 4K, it crops to 1.35 times. Or like the Canon EOS R, when you shoot in 4K, crops 1.74 times. So just be aware that some cameras, when you go from 1080p to 4K, will have a slight crop. So you need to keep that in mind when shopping for your lens. Now, wide-angle lenses are great, but they aren't super versatile. They can only capture wide things and aren't really great for close-up shots. So if you're looking for a more versatile lens that can get pretty wide but also zoom in decently far, then I'd recommend getting a standard lens. The standard lens that I own and recommend is the Canon 24-70mm version 2, and a cheaper alternative to that is the 24-105, and a great standard lens option if you're shooting on an APS-C sensor camera would be the 17-50 Sigma or the 17-55 Canon. And kind of an in-between lens between a standard and a wide angle that I really like is the Sigma 18-35, which doesn't work on a full frame camera but is great for crop sensor cameras. But standard lenses are great for when you're shooting things like live events or live concerts or weddings or anything where you quickly need to cover a lot of content in both wide and close-up shots without having to change out a lens and risk missing any important moments. So my 24-70 is what I use for 90% of my wedding videos, as it's a great lens for portraits because it's been said that the most flattering focal length on the human face is between 70 and 100mm. For example, compare this 16mm close-up versus this 70mm close-up of my buddy Tanner, and as you can see, it's much more flattering to use tighter focal lengths when getting close-up shots of people's faces. Now, if you plan on shooting wildlife or live performance events or live sports where you know that you're going to be far removed from your subject and won't be able to get any closer, then you'll want to invest in a telephoto lens. The telephoto lens that I use is the Canon 70-200, and a cheaper alternative to this would be the Tamron 70-200, which you can get at half the price for comparable quality. And the times I use my telephoto lens is when I physically can't get any closer to my subject, so I'm forced to zoom in to fill all of my frame with my subject. Now, because I always try and get as close to my subject as possible, I don't use this lens very often. It's my least used lens, but it is essential for those times when you don't have the option to get any closer, so it's good to have in your camera bag. But let's now move on to the second thing I look for when buying a lens, and that is, how well does it see it? This refers to the overall quality and sharpness of the image of the lens. Generally, the more you spend, the sharper, higher quality glass you're going to get. However, after watching hundreds of reviews and lens comparisons online, I have found lenses like the Sigma Art series that can offer comparable quality and sharpness to the Canon L series lenses for almost half the price. Sigma and Tamron are two awesome third-party lens manufacturers that create comparable lens options for much less. And generally speaking, prime or fixed lenses, meaning they're fixed at one focal length and can't zoom in, are generally going to give you a higher quality, sharper image compared to zoom lenses that allow you to zoom in and out. And the most popular focal length for a fixed lens is the 50mm. This is because a 50mm is said to replicate what the human eye can see as far as distance and perspective goes. So if you're looking to pick up a prime lens, the 50mm is probably the first one I'd recommend picking up. For me personally, all my prime lenses are Sigma Arts. Like I mentioned, they're a lot cheaper than Canon L series primes. Again, the trade-off is they're not going to be weather sealed, they're going to be a little bit heavier, and the autofocus isn't quite as quick, but it's still pretty dang good. So again, don't get too caught up just buying name brand lenses. There's a lot of great third-party lenses as well that you can get for a lot cheaper, but just be aware of some of the trade-offs. And the last thing to look for when buying a lens is how much light does it need to see. This refers to the aperture or f-stop of a lens. When shopping for a lens, you'll usually see an F with a number next to it. That number is the lens's minimal aperture that it can reach. Essentially, the lower the number, the nicer the lens is going to be. And this is because the lower your aperture can go, the wider it can open up to let in more light into your camera. And the more light that it lets into your camera, the less noise your image will have when shooting in low light situations. So to achieve a high quality image in low light situations, it's not only important to have a camera that does well in low light, but more importantly, you need to have a lens that is capable of going down to a low aperture, like my primes that go down to a 1.4 f-stop. Also, the lower your f-stop goes, the more background blur your image will have. This is called depth of field and is a very desirable look when it comes to creating cinematic images, as it allows you to separate your subject from the background, creating more depth. Now, when buying a zoom lens, I'd recommend finding a lens that can go down to at least a 2.8. Going back to these two lenses, this one's twice as expensive because it can go down to a 2.8 versus this one can only go down to a 4. So it's not going to do as well in low light, and it's not going to give you as much background blur. So you're literally paying almost twice as much just for those two things. I strongly recommend that you avoid zoom lenses that show two numbers in the f-stop. This means that when you zoom in, the aperture will change to the higher number, which is terrible for video because if you zoom in the middle of your shot, it will suddenly get darker as the aperture goes up. So there you have a quick look at some of the lenses I own and recommend. I'd first recommend buying some good zoom lenses so you have some versatility, and then once you've covered all those focal lengths, I'd start investing in some good prime lenses that you can use for very specialized moments. Some cheaper options would be something like a Canon 50mm 1.4 and a Canon 50mm 1.8 that you can get for around $100. So there you have it. Those are the three main things that I look for when buying a lens. Obviously, there's other smaller things to look for, and I mentioned a few already, but here's a look at 7 more things to keep in mind when buying a lens. Number 1 is the size and weight. You may find a good deal, but be aware of the size and weight, because if you're a little bit smaller, you might not be able to carry around a heavier lens all day long. Next thing to look for is if it's weather sealed or not. So if you shoot a lot in the rain or snow or a lot of dirty situations, you'll want to get a lens that is dust and water resistant. Next thing to look for is autofocus compatibility. Some lenses are manual, like my 12mm, doesn't have any autofocus capabilities, and even the lenses that do have some autofocus capabilities might have slower motors than the on-brand lenses, which means it might not focus as accurately or quickly. Another thing to look for is the filter thread size. This is important to know when shopping for filters like NDs or polarizers, because you'll have to buy multiple filters if you have multiple lenses with different thread sizes. Like for example, my 16-35 has a thread size of 82mm, but my 24-105 has a thread size of 77. So these will take different filters. Now you can buy step-up rings that allow you to put a little ring on here that will allow you to put bigger filters on here, but just something to be aware of. Another thing is the number of aperture blades. Some lenses have more or less aperture blades that are going to give you a different looking starburst when shooting into the sun or bright lights at high apertures, and you might prefer one look over another. Another thing to look for is image stabilization. Some lenses give you the option to turn on or off image stabilization, which is great if you shoot a lot of handheld or if you're a vlogger. This personally isn't a huge deal to me, as I'm usually using a gimbal or glide cam, so I turn off that image stabilization anyway in those scenarios, but it's a nice extra to have when shooting photos or shooting handheld. And last thing to look for, just like in the camera body, is to be aware of the age of the lens. Look to see if there's newer versions that have recently come out or are about to come out, and based on your budget, decide if you'd rather have a brand new one with the latest and greatest or save some cash and buy an older version. Also, if you have a choice to choose between buying a nice camera and a nice lens, I'd say buying a nice lens is more important, because if you have a Red Dragon, that shoots 6K, but you're using a really cheap soft lens on that camera that can only go down to a 4 aperture, then your image isn't going to be very sharp and it's not going to be able to take advantage of all the resolution in your nice camera. And in low light situations, your image is going to get really noisy with that bad lens, defeating the purpose of having a nice image quality in your RED camera. Whereas if you have a cheap beginner camera that only shoots 1080p, but you have a super sharp high quality prime lens that can stop all the way down to 1.4, then you're going to get a really sharp high quality 1080 image with that nice background blur, and you're not going to have any noise shooting in low light. So basically, a sharp, clean 1080p image is going to look better than a soft, noisy 6K image. So when it comes to deciding where to invest your money, make sure to put a good chunk of that money into buying some nice lenses. Not to mention that cameras depreciate in value much quicker than lenses, so if you buy a good lens, it will retain its value much longer. So there you have it, guys. Those are some things to keep in mind when buying a lens. What does it see? How well does it see it? And how much light is needed to see it, along with those 7 smaller things. But if you have any further questions, please let me know.